Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your hard work. I know it isn't easy to make these kinds of decisions. First, I should say that I definitely share your concerns and those that have been expressed about the deficits and debt. I think it is a looming problem. I think interest on the debt is going to crowd out everybody's favorite program, whatever it is, and that is something that we really do need to focus on. The question is, how do we get out of this hole? And there are 3.5 options that I see. Perhaps 4. One is to cut expenditures, and indeed that's the path that's chosen in this budget. And as I understand the numbers, you would maintain the sequester levels for defense and for non-defense, and then cut, starting in 2017, non-defense discretionary by some $236 billion over the remainder of the term. So we've got the sequester for defense, and then we've got the sequester for non-defense plus additional cuts. That's the choice, cut expenditures. I would just parenthetically remind everyone that the sequester was designed to be dumb, and it is, because it's across the board. It was designed to provoke us to find a better solution. That was the explicit understanding at the time of the passage of the Act, and yet we haven't been able to do that. So I see no magic in the sequester number if indeed we can find other alternatives. And I realize the Chair has left, there's a space in the budget for the possibility of finding another alternative, but I certainly think that should be one of our tasks. So number one way to get out of the hole is cut expenditures. The second is to increase revenues. And by the way, a big category of the budget that never gets discussed is what's called tax expenditures. And this is recognized as expenditures by everyone. Republican and Democratic economists refer to that as tax expenditures. The decisions made not to apply taxes to certain individuals in certain circumstances, and it ranges from everything from the carried interest for hedge fund managers to the deductibility of home mortgages. But it's that number today is $1.5 trillion a year. It's larger than the entire discretionary budget of the United States government. And when the tax code was last reformed in 1986, in real dollars, it was about $500 billion. In other words, it's almost tripled over the last 25 or 30 years with very little oversight and very little thought about whether those tax expenditures should continue. So increasing revenues would include looking at tax expenditures and seeing if that's a possible way to help us out of the hole. The third option, and the best, I think we would all agree, is to grow the economy. Now, there's a theory out there that if you lower taxes, that will automatically grow the economy. I've never seen any data that actually substantiates that. Part of the way you grow the economy is making investments. The interstate highway system was an enormous boost to the national economy, and it was an enormous investment, which, by the way, the last generation of Americans paid for. They paid for it. They paid for it. They raised a gas tax on themselves to pay for the interstate highway system. I would argue that the most successful economic development program in the history of the United States, in the entire history of the United States, was the GI Bill after World War II, which propelled millions of Americans into the middle class. That was an expenditure program. That wasn't a tax cut. That was an expenditure program that created the growth in the economy that propelled us through the 60s and 70s and into our current era. So growing the economy is the answer. But a one-sided response to say we're only going to grow the economy by cutting taxes, number one, I don't think there's evidence to validate that. And number two, it ignores the power of appropriate investments in infrastructure, education, Head Start, early education, those things that actually do grow the economy. And remember I said there were 3.5 ways that we had to deal with this. The other one is healthcare costs. If you look at the growth of federal expenditures over the next 30 years, it is almost entirely attributable to healthcare costs. Medicare, Medicaid, veterans' pensions, pensions of federal workers, it's almost entirely attributable to healthcare costs. And if we don't do something about healthcare costs themselves, not by shifting them to the states or shifting them to the seniors, but by doing something about the core, undeniable fact that we pay twice as much per capita for healthcare in this country than virtually any other country in the world, until we tackle that substantive problem, we're not going to be able to solve this budget problem. That's going to squeeze out everything. Defense, non-defense, Head Start, battleships, everything else. Healthcare has to be where we can really make some, we could erase the deficit if we could control healthcare costs, and indeed it appears over the last couple of years, healthcare inflation has slowed to the slowest level in 50 years. The President would argue that's a result of the Affordable Care Act. Others would argue it's a bunch of other factors, but whatever it is, if that continues, that is in itself a huge help to getting us out of this hole. We can't get out of the hole with one answer. There is no silver bullet. Cuts by themselves are not the way we're going to get where we want to get. A friend of mine in Maine used to say, there's rarely a silver bullet, there's often silver buckshot. A multiplicity of solutions that together will get you where you want to go. And my only problem with your budget, Mr. Chairman, is that you focus on one aspect, one part of what amounts to a total $5 trillion budget, or $6 trillion if you include tax expenditures. You're really focused on one very small part of that for the cuts, and I just don't think that is how we're going to get there. So I would argue that I commend you for the work that's gone into this. The hard part, of course, is in the details, but I hope that we can try to find an approach that will lead us toward a balanced budget. That's a goal I share. But do it in such a way that will help us to grow the economy and strengthen this country in terms of all the people that have a contribution to make and a role to play in our society. And Mr. Chairman, I loved it when you began. God bless the committee. This may have been the room where George Mitchell famously said to Oliver North, although he's often asked to do so, God does not take sides in American politics. I couldn't help but think that when you said that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.